This week we're going to discuss the portion of the week which is known as Balak. And included within this discussion will be what I consider to be, from a personal aspect, my most controversial lecture. It will probably come as a shock to most and little comfort to very few. But nevertheless, I think the time has come when we have to face up to not the illusion, but the reality, in as much as we are connected with the age of Aquarius, and in this age, everything is going to become revealed in one way or another. The Pasha is known as Balak. Vayar Balak ben Sipor et kol asher asa Yisrael la'amori. And Balak, who was one of the formidable enemies of the nation of Israel, and who was, according to the Zohar, a very powerful mystic, but from the dark side. Very powerful. In other words, his strength did not lie in the numbers, in the amount of people that surrounded themselves within his presence, but that he was an individual. Both this is according to all of the commentaries on the Torah, that his power was profound and that the world feared him. And throughout this Parsha of Balak, we come to a realization that he was out to destroy the Israelite, not on a physical level, but on a metaphysical level. And the Zohar describes much of the battle between Balak and also his associate, who was known as Bilam, and both of them gathered together to possibly bring about the end of the nation of Israel, chas v'shalom. There aren't many weekly portions that are named after people. We have Noah. We don't have a parsha named after Abraham, who you might say was the first Jew. Neither after Isaac. It says Eila Toldot, but not Isaac. And then we do have a woman mentioned, which is Sarah. But we have one named after Yitro, who was also one of the chieftains of the tribe of Midian. And now we have Balak. Now certainly the Torah could have seen fit to name this portion of the Torah in any number of ways. Yet it chose to name it Balak. Another strange, and this is chapter 22 of Numbers, another strange section within this portion of the week of Balak is when in chapter 24, when Bilam, at the request of Balak, came to curse the Jew, and that was his intention, he then somehow gets lost in his objective as some might say. And in chapter 24, verse 5, praises them by saying, "How goodly are thy tents, O Jacob, thy dwellings, O Israel. The Matovo Olecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael," which is recited by every congregant who enters the synagogue and recites this verse. It's the first verse upon entering the Bet HaKnesset, indicating that this verse has some unduly and possibly enormous power, that it should be recited at the very beginning of all prayers. And yet, this same prayer was uttered by the foremost and arch enemy of Israel, Bilam. How can we explain that? How do we explain it away? And there are many other aspects to this Parshat Balak, because we see, and even the way the Torah declares and states, that he had a direct connection, Bilam, that is, had a direct connection with the Lord, because it says, Vayavo in chapter 22 of Balak, verse 20, "And God, the Lord, came unto Bilam at night and said to him," and whatever he said to him. And we see mentioned throughout the chapter 22, again in verse 31, where not only the word Elohim is not mentioned, but the tetragrammaton is associated with, in verse 31, "Then the Lord opened the eyes of Bilam, and he saw the angel of the Lord." Angel of the Lord. Now we know that, and we have discussed this on many occasions, that the tetragrammaton, meaning the Yud Kei Vav Kei, and Elohim, which also means the Lord, are merely expressions or different expressions of levels of consciousness or revelation of light. And the tetragrammaton is considered to be on a much higher level than the Elohim. And here we see that the tetragrammaton is referring itself to Bilam. And if that is not sufficient concerning these two people, there is not only in the Talmud, but in the Midrash, where it says that in the nation of Israel, there shall never rise a prophet as Moses. However, says the Midrash, only in the nation of Israel shall there never rise a prophet greater than Moses. But amongst the nations of the world, there will arise a prophet on that level of Moses, and that is Bilam, supposedly a non-Jew, because it says he is amongst the nations of the world. And just to confuse the issue just a bit more, the Ari tells us on the verse in Balak, when after the disaster of Bilam, in other words, his words were somehow twisted, and he did not succeed in cursing the Jews, and he was going to be punished. However, he pleaded with the Lord that he should not be punished, or he should not die an unnatural death. And he says, Tamut nafshi mavet yisharim. In other words, he prayed to the Lord that his death should be a death of natural causes, because he felt what he had in his behavior, in the way he conducted himself, that he was deserving of an unnatural death. And what happened was he was praying that it should not happen. And the truth of the matter is, we know that it is not true, says the Ari and the Zohar, because it says that Bilam was struck down. He was struck down by a sword. And he did not die a natural death, which seems to be a contradiction within the verse. And so the Ari prepares us by saying in Sefer Halikutim, which is volume 17 of the Kitvei Ari edition, Agda Sod Inyan, but know the secret of this matter, Ki Bilam Nidgalgel Benaval. Shezeu Remez Otiot Naval. In other words, that Bilam, who was a non-Jew, was incarnated in Naval, who was Jewish, and Bilam, says the Ari, was Lavan, the father-in-law of Jacob, and therefore the letters of Lavan is Lamed Bet Nun, and the letters of Naval are identical, Nun Bet Lamed. And therefore, and we shall continue the rest of this Ari, which is so unusual, in that he says, Bilam's wish was granted, but it was granted when Bilam was incarnated as a Jew. But while, as I said before, all of the commentators expressed the view that he was speared, and that's the way he died. And yet he had asked for a natural death, and the Ari says, since he asked this in the form of a question, also in the Sefer Likutim, since these words were not decisive, Hare lo met mavet yesharim, because Bilam did not die a natural death, as it says in the Medrash, Shelo ratza Pinchas lahorgo. Pinchas did not want to kill Bilam. Why did he want to kill him? Rak b'cherev hatamei, he didn't want for him to draw this kind of energy, because even in death, the victim, in a way, is drawing energy, which is a subject by itself, would be drawing energy from Pinchas, because the act of murdering somebody means that act is a transfer of the rotzeach, of the murderer, in effect, being transferred now into the victim, and Pinchas did not want that. Because if Pinchas had speared him, then he would have died. That would be considered a natural death, because he would have, in effect, have been the recipient of this enormous power that was within Pinchas. And that itself would have been considered a mavet yesharim, a justifiable, a righteous kind of death. And therefore the Torah says, Im kein lama katva haTorah, divrei batala chas v'shalom. So how come that the request of Bilam is even mentioned if he was not going to suffer, or if he was not going to die a natural death? It should not mention it at all. And therefore the Ari concludes that he did die a mavet yesharim, not at the hands of Pinchas, not a natural death, as it is stated, but in his incarnation through the years into Nabal, who was Jewish, who suffered a spear death, and then again was incarnated where the death was a natural death. So the verse is not without reason. Bilam died a natural death, he died an unnatural death, and both are correct. And both are correct. What seems to emerge from this Ari is that non-Jews are incarnated into Jews and vice versa. Which leads me then into another question. Then what is a Jew? Now we have, for those who are interested in rabbinical politics, are familiar with the raging battle, I should say, between Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, on who is a Jew. I might touch upon that, if time permits, at the end of the lecture, but I don't believe that is as important as once we can establish what is a Jew, and I have heard very little conversation about what is a Jew. Now, one might say, well, if an individual is born of a Jewish mother, then he is Jewish. That makes him Jewish. And therefore, that's a Jew. And if one is born from a non-Jewish mother, that makes the individual not Jewish. But that doesn't explain away or describe for us what is a Jew. Is he something different than everybody else? You might say his mother is Jewish, but does that in essence make him different? And if there is a difference, what is the difference? Because the fact that he is born from a Jewish mother doesn't explain away what does a Jew mean. It tells us his mother is Jewish. It's like when someone asks you, what does wisdom mean? Well, wisdom, if you have wisdom, then you can understand many things and so forth, and et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't explain for us what is wisdom. So we are here tonight, hopefully, to achieve an explanation of what is a Jew, and then maybe when the rabbis finally come to an understanding of what is a Jew, then maybe there is time for a little politicking and understanding then who is a Jew. But I believe once we know what is a Jew, there will be very little space and time and politics for whom is a Jew. We learned that from the Torah, it's at least from the Torah, on many, many passages, and we have discussed these passages in past sessions, like in Exodus, chapter 15, immediately following the great miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea, and of course I'm not adding the other 10 miracles that occurred in Egypt itself, immediately following the splitting of the Red Sea, which was a phenomenal miracle, in verse 22 of Exodus, it says, and Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea, and then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went down 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters. And the people complained. Now, why should the people complain? If Moses, with the help of the Lord, could split the Red Sea, I'm sure a little feat like creating water wasn't that difficult, and yet immediately it tells us they complained. And of course the miracle happened and water appeared. And this goes on in many other instances where they're always complaining. They are always complaining. They are, in fact, according to the Torah, the habitual claimer and complainer is the Jew. No one else. It goes right on through Exodus, and it goes right on through Bamidbar, and it would take me a full session just to even repeat the constant complaints that the Jews had at Moses, and as we discussed even in Korach. When that great miracle of Korach, and when the fire from the Lord came down and devoured the sacrifice of Aaron and not Korach, it was indicative. And then what happened to Korach? An earthquake or whatever, and the earth swallowed up these people, indicating clearly, certainly for the brilliant people present here, and those who were even more brilliant, because they are called the Dor Deah, the generation of the Exodus, is considered the Dor Deah, meaning they were even brighter than we are. And immediately, the day after this all happened, the miracle of swallowing up these bad people who surrounded Korah, they blamed Moses for their death. And why did he kill him? I mean, this is so irrational, so incomprehensible, and we are discussing the Jew. Is that what the Jew is all about? The constant complainer? Never satisfied? That is the full description beyond any doubt that one can deduce from the Torah itself. If we were to take the Torah by and within itself, you just have to go to Israel. What do they say? He's an Israeli. What do they mean he's an Israeli? Of course, there it's more pronounced. They're in the land of energy. He acts like an Israeli. What does it mean? You could do all for him yesterday and provide all of his needs yesterday, but today, heaven forbid, that you don't give him a glass of water because you didn't hear him. You will never hear the end of it. This is the Jew. And that Jew stems from the door of Exodus. As I say, follow right through in case you want, and I don't want to quote them because there is too much that I have to discuss tonight. But if you want to, you can then go to chapter 16, verse 1 and 2, and throughout Bamidbar. And after all this is said and done, right? After all this is said and done, let us now touch upon the most magnificent, if not the most important happening that ever took place in history, which is referred to as revelation on Mount Sinai. Nothing more important took place for humankind than the revelation of the Ten Commandments. And what are we told there? What are we told there? That when the Lord was ready to present the Torah on Mount Sinai, he came to the Jews in Shemot, in Exodus, chapter 19, verse 7. And we have another description of the Jew. Another description of the Jew. Verse 8. And it said, and all the people answered together about concerning the Ten Commandments, and Moses came and called for the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord commanded them. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we shall do. Obedient people. Obedient people. Not only that, but where is the verse that then goes on to say, Naseh v'nishma? More important than that, in chapter 19, it says Naseh. There it says Naseh, but then there, I just for the moment forget where it says Naseh v'nishma. Also here in Parshat, I believe it's Kitisa, but in any event where it is well known that the Jews said, we will do, and then we are going to listen what you have to offer. Do you imagine? Have you ever found a Jew that if you told him to accept what you're going to tell him, he says, of course I do. They said, Nasa v'nishma, we will do, and then we'll hear what you have to tell us. Another description of the Jew, a very obedient type of Jew. And I might let it rest right there and say, complainers, but obedient. Complainers, but obedient. Always complaining about the Lord, and yet they'll always listen to the Lord. I don't know how you can reconcile the two ideas, but this is the description. But however, in the Talmud, these very obedient people, says the Talmud, in the Midrash, that just prior to the Jews receiving the revelation of the Ten Commandments, the expression is, the Lord bent over the mountain like a hamburger or a sandwich. You know, can you picture first the mountain is flat, then he lifted the mountain, and he put all the Jews in there. And put all the Jews in this hamburger or sandwich, must have been a large one, and he's told them that if you do not accept the Torah, sham tehei kfuratam, there will be your burial ground. Now, if they're obedient people, as the scripture indicates, they said Nasa v'nishma, and all Jews are obedient people, all Jews perform all the mitzvot, then what was the necessity of picking up the mountain, putting them all in there, and saying, if you do not accept the Torah, there will be your burial ground. There will be the end of it. So, from the Torah itself, not only do we get a kind of very despicable picture of what a Jew is, on the other hand, we get a kind of very obedient picture of people, and then we have the Talmud coming around and telling us, no, that Nasa v'nishma was not all that it shaped up to be. It wasn't all that. So what is it? Can we reconcile the whole thing? Can we understand the whole thing? So we're still in a dilemma. What is the Jew? Just to confuse the issue a little, and maybe that's what Kabbalah really does, is confusing us. Now, if we really weren't involved in Kabbalah, you could accept it any which way. If you're Orthodox, you say Nasa v'nishma. If you're not Orthodox, then you repeat many of the stories, and I did hear this story from the district attorney down in Brooklyn. One day he said that if he was to pursue all of the mesirot, in other words, all of the squealing by the people in Brooklyn on their neighbors, he said he would be busy for the next 200 years. So they don't really take the mesirah, in other words, someone saying evil on another person, for the district attorney to pursue what they thought was evil wrongdoing by the part of other people. One of the safest places, again, we're going to go to a Zohar, because anything I have to say, if it was just an opinion, or if I was just a rabbi, didn't have much to say on my own, we can spend a lot of time. But inasmuch as we believe that if we can only study what the Zohar or the Ari reveals for us, then we kind of get to things that make everything very clear. Aleph, Genesis 1. There are 2 volumes on Genesis in the Zohar. This is Genesis 1. And this is page 198 in the Zohar of the Sulam. And his subject is V'chamesh minim inin be'erev rav. There are 5 different kinds of erev rav, the mixed multitude. A term, mixed multitude. It seems that they represent people. Who are this mixed multitude? And so we are told of another story in the Zohar concerning the Exodus. As if we didn't have enough trouble with the Jews, now we're getting into more problems. That when the Exodus took place, there was a Rashi, as a commentator, right on the story of the Exodus, says that only 1/5 of the people who left Egypt were original Jews. Again, whatever that means. 4/5 of the people who emerged from Egypt were people of other nations who converted. 4/5. Only 1/5 was Jewish, whatever that means, and 4/5 were the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. And there was a discussion going on between, and we have touched upon this in a previous session, there was a discussion between the Lord and Moses. Lord says, Moses, don't make a mistake. Do not accept these converts. They're only going to spell trouble. Moses says, I know what I'm doing. Now, I mean, can you picture this kind of a conversation? Moses telling the Lord, I know what I'm doing. And he goes ahead and accepts these converts. And therefore, 4/5 of the Jewish population that exited from Egypt were converts. They are referred to as the Erev Rav, the mixed multitudes. That's the name. In other words, they came from so many different nations. They are referred to as the mixed multitudes.
This is the 600,000?
Yes.
Of the 600,000?
Of the 600,000. 4/5 were the Erev Rav. Okay? Now, of these Erev Rav is the discussion that the Zohar is spending a great deal of ink, which we unfortunately will not have that much time, but at your own leisure, you can make an attempt to decipher what he's trying to say. There are 5 different kinds. And he says the first kind is Amalek. Amalek. Now, if that is a term unfamiliar to you, Amalek, in the portion of Beshalach, in Exodus, at the end, in fact, chapter 17, verse 8. And it says, Vayavo Amalek v'yilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim. And Amalek came and fought with Israel in Refidim. And that is where you had, and Moses tells Joshua choose people and go out and fight with Amalek. And I will stand on top of the hill and with the rod of the Lord in my hand. And that's what Joshua did. Went out and fought with Amalek, and Moses with Aaron and Hur, Ben-Hur, it's a distorted film, incidentally. And Moses and Hur, Alu Rosh HaGivah, went up with Moses together. This should be familiar. It's a very fascinating story. And when it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, and the Zohar says, well, what do you mean his hand? His right hand? V'gava Yisrael. And when he had no strength, with his right hand, Amalek prevailed. And then it continues in verse 12. But Moses' hands were heavy, and so they took a stone and put it under him. And he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady in this position until the going down of the sun. And Joshua, discomfited, he didn't destroy, but the word is vayachalosh. Again, we can spend a full year just on this little incident, but the point that I want to make is something else. But this is a story about Amalek, and he weakened Amalek. He weakened. It doesn't say he destroyed him. He weakened him with the edge of a sword. There's much to ask at this question. But anyway, it says, and we read this on a particular portion, just about Purim time, that we are told we must efface and utterly blot out any Zecher Amalek. Never to remember him. Blot him out. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation because of this little incident that happened. Every generation will have a war with Amalek. You hear about Amalek today? No. And yet the verse is informing us that Joshua only weakened him. First of all, why did he get rid of him? He only weakened him. Why did he only weaken him? But in any event, there's a Parshat Zachor, a reading in the Torah on the Shabbat before Purim, in which every woman, as well as man, is obligated to hear the reading of these few sentences, which is read in Deuteronomy. No other reading of the Torah is ever a requisite for women. They do not have to attend synagogue or temple. They do not have to. However, this particular verse, when it is read, Parshat Zachor, it is referred to, which I believe is at the end of Parshat Kitetse in Deuteronomy. Yes. In chapter 25, verse 7. And there again, Moses repeats this incident in Exodus. In verse 17, remember what Amalek did unto you by the way as you came out of Egypt. And he met you along the way. And he prepared to do war. And at that point, the Lord interceded, and therefore, Timche et Zecher Amalek, we repeat that twice. Blot out any recollection of Amalek. Now, as I always jokingly remark, we say this twice. The Jews commanded, in fact, the women too. Remember to blot out Amalek. And if that wasn't enough for the Jew to repeat it twice, the verse then concludes with the final two words, Lo tishkach, do not forget. How many times does he have to tell us? says it twice, remember. And as if the remembering, it seems we have short memories, and I can understand why he then repeats it again, lo tishkach, do not forget, because Jews really do have short memories. You look through the entire book of Exodus, we have short memories. So he has to repeat it twice to remember, and once not to forget. And this will happen to us. This is Amalek. Who is Amalek? Who is Amalek that was weakened? That was weakened. Wasn't destroyed. Why didn't Joshua destroy him? There was Moses, Aaron, and Hur. Finish him off. Who is Amalek? So the Zohar tells us. Amalek is Bilam and Balak. Two people, but they weren't. The incident with Bilam and Balak happens much later on. And it seems that there was a particular waging of a war with Balak and Bilam. Amalek, it doesn't say, was Bilam and Balak anywhere. This was Amalek. So it says Bilam and Balak haya mibchinat Amalek, says the Zohar. These two people represented that force known as Amalek. We are not discussing the nation called Amalek. In other words, the Zohar reveals for us, don't take everything literal. As it states in the Torah, Amalek does not mean the nation of Amalek. It means the force of Amalek, which was in Bilam and Balak. How does he arrive at that? Because ki tikach et ha'otiot ayin mem min Hashem Bilam, because Bilam is spelled out bet lamed ayin mem. You take the two letters. Take the two letters of Bilam, his name, va'otiot lamed kuf, and the two letters of the name of Balak. And what do you have? Amalek. That's how the Zohar says that story of Balak and Bilam is another repetition. In other words, they are the heir of Rav. Balak and Bilam were the heir of Rav. This were Jews who were conducting that little incident. And what is Amalek? Says the Zohar in many other places. It is that evil instinct that is in all of mankind. And therefore, we understand why the verse says in Exodus, he weakened Amalek. What do you mean he weakened? There was Moses. Moses could destroy anybody. He certainly could have destroyed Amalek. No, he weakened. What Amalek represented, he weakened him. Because if Moses finished off Amalek, meaning he finished off the evil inclination within all of us, then he made the tikkun for us. What are we left to do?
No free will.
There would again then be no free will, and therefore it says he only weakened us. He did us, in effect, he accomplished for us the same thing that he accomplished with the Middle Kingdom. As the Ari says right here in Sefer HaLikutim, what was the Exodus about? And this I've discussed on the subject of Passover. We're not discussing freedom. It's like July 4th, firecrackers. Maybe that's what we really should do on Passover. I think, in fact, more Jews would enjoy firecrackers than not having to eat chametz. Right? And then if you live in Israel and you want to live in the Holy Land, all you have to do is go into Tel Aviv, get all the pita you want. Except, I believe, it cannot be sold prominently. I think when you walk into the storekeeper, he must have it under his table. I think it's forbidden to openly display the bread, but you're permitted to go in, and purchase it if he conceals the bread. But in any event, I'm sure more people would be enjoying the pita. Most Jews today probably would enjoy pita and celebrating the Exodus if they must, if they feel, with firecrackers. The Exodus had nothing to do with the aspect of going out of slavery, as you already understand. But what was more important was that Moses broke the metaphysical power of the Middle Kingdom. That rule of the Middle Kingdom was broken. Amalek was not broken. That was not broken. This Amalek represents that internal me, which within everyone, as the Torah says in Parshat Noach, Ki yetzer lev adam ra minu rav. We are all born with an evil inclination, and that is the purpose of our tikkun, to overcome these evil inclinations. Therefore, Ve'elu heiminim erev rav. And where are these 5 types of mixed multitudes? Muravim b'Yisrael. They are amongst the Jews. They are right within the Jew. Not over there. In fact, he doesn't live in Germany. He doesn't live in Spain. He lives where the Jew is. Does that mean he always follows the Jew? No. He is in Israel. He is in Israel. He is found amongst the Israelites. And the Ari, to give us a more clearer description of that Jew, says again in Sefer Halikutim, the Ari, as you know, I am not making any declarations or statements that can be quoted in the press. All they would have to do is quote either Rabbi Shimon or the Bible or the Ari. But I could not be quoted because I'm not going to reveal anything to you that I believe in or that I feel. And the Sefer Halikutim, page 264, the Ari says as follows, on the verse of Asher Zamam, Ume'elu hayu erev rav, and the Torah, which is discussing the Jew, he's discussing about these from the erev rav. V'kol mi sheyesh hirur machshavot ra'ot hu mehem, and anybody who has an evil, hirur, and machshava has, hirur means a desire to be doing evil, or evil thoughts, whether he is Jewish or he's not Jewish, he is called Erev Rav. So if you know any Jew who has this kind of evil thought against his neighbor, you know that he is not from the original Jew, but he is from the mixed multitude. He is Jewish, but he is Erev Rav, says the Ari. And he is not a real Jew. But what was this conversation between Moses and the Lord, which we shall return to? But he is not from the original Jew of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is correct. He is not. The fact that he was born from a Jewish mother does not preclude that he is not from the Erev Rav. Can a real Jew be born? Yes. We're not discussing a hatred. Hatred is not part of the inheritance. Only money is part of the inheritance. But hatred does not genetically follow. That's each individual's own personal tikkun or correction. What's that?
From the same mother. Two brothers.
Two brothers. One can be from the Erev Rav, and one can be a real Jew, despite the fact that they are both from one mother, and therefore, that because each one has his own soul.
What about twins?
What?
What about twins?
Even twins. What's the difference, twins or two brothers born one after another? The important fact that emerges is the soul and the behavior of the individual will indicate where he's coming from. The fact that he's born from a Jewish mother indicates obviously something else entirely. Because two people can be born from a Jewish mother, and yet the Ari can say, observe him. If he has hatred in his heart, or he has evil thoughts in his mind, he is from the heir of Rav. No question. No question.
If he has it once,
What's that? There are very few Jews left. But yet there are so many Jews. You think there are very few Jews around? We know, for whatever reason, and I believe if we can only understand what is a Jew, the 1,000 questions that you're going to have after you leave this session tonight, hopefully can be answered by an understanding of what is a Jew.
but everybody has an evil thought here and there.
An evil thought towards man, because the verse here, the Ari is discussing about evil thoughts towards his fellow man. In other words, like if Shimon entered the house of a rabbi and he just wanted to explain about what Kabbalah is, and the rabbi said, look, I don't want to hear, and they immediately called the police to have Shimon evicted, even though he said, I'm leaving, but he still called the police. Or if a rabbi in the middle of the winter in Chicago, as I mentioned before, when Chezi is outside this rabbi's house, he takes a cold bucket of water in, 5 degrees below zero, and pours a whole bucket of water on him. Obviously, he must be from the heir of Rav. So that's quite simple. That's quite simple. You're asked, what's that?
Black and white.
That's black and white. So now we're beginning to understand that being a Jew isn't what we have always been led to believe, as we studied maybe even in elementary school in the secular subjects. I think it was 5 people who changed the face of the earth. And it's true. Einstein, Moses, Freud, the fellow who put Christendom on the map, a lot of Jews, Marx, made deep impressions on humankind. More so, as Mark Twain once remarked, the impressions that the handful of Jews do as compared to their numbers is so whacked out of their proportion, it's incredible. It just doesn't fit to the pattern of mankind. That so few Jews do such, I say not great, not necessarily great, but such deep movements within the stream of human thought, which is primarily where the action is, and there were a handful. There must be something special, he said to these Jews, and obviously there is something special. But that special doesn't always mean to indicate that it's always for the best. It's always good. But let us return now to the aspect of Amalek. So Amalek is in Israel. And now we can get a very small glimpse of what Balak and Balaam is about when we raise the question, Balaam, the man whose intent was to curse, and his prayer of cursing is the one that is recited by every Jew upon entering the synagogue, because he was Jewish. He was a channel. He was Jewish. He was part of that heir of Rav. So he was a channel. The fact that it was an evil channel, nevertheless, because he was Jewish, obviously to being a Jew there is a greater connection, which we shall also shortly understand. But it kind of relieves the pressure of the question. Now that is one kind of Erev Rav. And there is this one. And as I said, if we went through maybe one day we'll use that just as a basis for a study. Nevertheless, I think I'd like to give you this one. Now, there's another kind of Erev Rav. Who are they, says the Zohar? And this is, if you're all seated, okay, good and well. Bonim bet hakneset u'midrashot. They built synagogues and temples and houses of study. Oh, that's pretty good. Why is he putting it in such a negative tone? Go build it. Not only that, if you think that's all they do, no. V'notnim b'hem sefer Torah. They even give the sefer Torah, Sifrei Torot. Yet, says the Zohar, what is all of this action towards? Keneged hakatuv ir umigdal v'rosho b'shamayim. If some of you are not immediately familiar with that idea, at the end of in Noah, there is something called about the Migdal Bavel, right? The Tower of Babel. I won't go into the story of the Tower of Babel, but the Tower of Babel were evil people, but they were going to make a name for themselves. In fact, the Tower of Babel, according to the Zohar, was so sophisticated. They had all of the knowledge that, can you imagine today, is there anyone around with enough sophistication to build a 1,000-story building? Nobody. As high as they can conceivably go is 108 stories. Build 100, build 1,000, or maybe a 2,000, because it says they built skyscrapers that reached up into the heavens. In other words, I don't believe it was a very cloudy, foggy day, and that's what the Torah is referring to. I would assume that if the Torah says that they were building something to reach the heavens, and that was evil. So these people, says the Zohar, ve'einam mitkavnim l'shem shamayim. They are not building these houses of worship. They are not presenting these Torot for the sake of producing enlightenment, for the sake of producing houses of study. Ela lasot la'atzmam v'naseh l'go sham. They made it for themselves. Whatever they did was for their own edification. Whatever they did, these people, that doesn't mean all, but we are discussing the Erev Rav. When a Jew presents a house of worship, I remember I was not a little kid, but my first trip to Chicago when I was 18, and at that time, the Jews lived on the west side, if anybody is familiar. This is going back many years. And I come for the first time that I was ever out of New York, and my first trip was to Chicago. It was on behalf of the yeshiva. And what do I see? 5 Taj Mahals on one street. You know, like not one 5 blocks away, 5 Taj Mahals, not 5 little storefronts of synagogues. 5 Taj Mahals that I haven't seen another one around. They don't build them that way anymore. Beautiful edifices. 5 on one block. And of course, the first question I raised was, they must have millions of Jews living here. You know that you need 5 on one block. You got to put them right there. I mean, you can't build another one another block away, or 2 blocks away, or 5 blocks away. 5 on one block. Needless to say, they do not exist. And I don't want to say, or shall I say the usual pattern occurred there as happens all over the United States. It was over with. All right. We'll continue. We'll have a short break.